been my fear since the beginning that because the FBI has been so politicized and now is openly targeting one side, that is going to raise the temperature on this boiling pot, and the pot's going to boil over, and the premier law enforcement agency is going to have a hand in a lot of violence and destruction as a result of it.
Keeping our republic is on the line, and it requires patriots with great passion, dedication, and eternal vigilance to preserve our freedoms. Jenny Beth Martin is the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. She is an author, a filmmaker, and one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world. But the title she is most proud of is mom to her boy-girl twins. She has been at the forefront, fighting to protect America's core principles for more than a decade. Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
In today's episode, I continue my conversation with Steve Friend, a former FBI agent who is now an FBI whistleblower. If you missed the first part of this interview, be sure to go back and listen to that episode in the previous podcast. Steve Friend, thank you so much for being back on the Jenny Beth Show. In case people did not hear the first episode, they need to go back and listen to it, but let's bring them up to speed on who you are.
I am a former special agent with the FBI. I was with the FBI for about 9 years, became a FBI whistleblower last summer, 2022, and I brought my concerns about the January 6th investigations being statistical manipulation about domestic terrorism in the country and heavy-handed tactics to arrest individuals that were associated with that case. And recently, I am now a published author. I have a personal memoir that's out titled True Blue, My Journey from Beat Cop to Suspended FBI Whistleblower.
And you testified before Congress? What was that like?
It was surreal. I mean, I guess how many people can say they got a chance to do that? So there's definitely an element of novelty to it. But I got to say, I think having been in a courtroom many times in my career, testifying in front of juries or grand juries, definitely equipped me to handle the incoming fire from one side of the aisle.
And were they receptive to your testimony? How did that go?
Well, I think that the Republicans certainly asked me a number of questions, and I'd done a deposition for multiple hours ahead of time, so they had a lot of material already. And they asked me some questions, but the Democrats certainly were more interested in attacking the messenger, which unfortunately has been my history with the FBI and the mainstream media, and then now the Democrat Party, where they try to paint you as a grifter or a conspiracy theorist. But interestingly enough, they never said I was wrong.
And one of your colleagues testified there, and he had a really horrible experience, right? Like when he moved and his wife was pregnant.
Yes, Garrett O'Boyle, who he had made whistleblower disclosures, brought them to Congress. The FBI contrived a way for him to be transferred to a new assignment across the country. And when he arrived, before his household goods arrived, he sold his house, packed everything up. He walked in the door and they suspended him on the premise that he was leaking information to the media, which he did not do. I actually know the person who did. It's not Garrett. And they used that to facilitate his indefinite suspension and actually seize his household goods and hold them hostage. He had to wind up coming out of pocket substantially to get his household goods. His wife was 2 weeks postpartum, and it was coming up on the winter in Wisconsin where they were stuck and didn't have winter coats for his children, now 4 little girls.
That is just maddening. They suspended you without pay. Your wife wound up also losing her job that was tied to the government, or the company she worked for had government contracts. They do. It seems like they do everything they can to punish you for coming forward.
Yeah, I think that there's an element of we're going to make an example out of these individuals, and certainly the recent training that I've gotten access to, where you have to do the annual training just like anybody who works in anything, and the FBI gives you training on whistleblowing. And it gives you training on identifying potential insider threats. An insider threat would be like a Robert Hansen who was taking information and sending it over to Russia. For my entire career, they were separate training. And wouldn't you know it, this last year, the FBI combined the trainings into one slide deck PowerPoint, and the intimation was very clear that whistleblowers are an insider threat to the FBI, to be on lookout for them.
When you first brought your concerns up to your supervisor and then the supervisor above your supervisor, you were told that your concerns, let's just very quickly summarize, you were opposed to a SWAT team explain what you were opposed to that you raised as a concern.
Yeah, I was concerned that we were sending a SWAT team to arrest an individual who was being charged with a felony but had pledged to cooperate with law enforcement when he was interviewed. And I felt that that was an unnecessary risk to public safety and to FBI personnel safety. And when I voiced that concern, and in addition to my concerns about how the FBI has sort of manipulated the crime stats with the way it's handling January 6th, I was told that I represented a fringe minority within the FBI, a very fringe belief, and I was conspiratorial. And then my special agent in charge even said that she'd never seen anything like this in her 2+ decades, and that she had been on the 7th floor of J. Edgar Hoover building, which is FBI speak for I'm an important person because the director works on the 7th floor. And so that sort of is her way of saying I'm a position of authority. And she said, I was on the 7th floor that day, Steve, and those people tried to seize our democracy. And it was just very apparent to me that the FBI has bought in wholly to this narrative that we've been told that January 6th is the worst event that's happened in the history of the country, worse than September 11th, worse than the Civil War, when in fact, whatever happened that day, certainly the loss of life doesn't compare to anything that we saw on 9/11 or even in the summer riots of 2020. But the trough is pretty deep financially for people to attach themselves to January 6th, and we've seen that happen here in the last couple of years.
Part of your concerns were that they were asking you to violate your oath of office and your training, to disregard training that they had given you, such as using SWAT team force to go after someone who said he would voluntarily cooperate. And when you brought all of this forward, they say you're a conspiracy theorist and in the fringe minority within the FBI. Shouldn't the majority within the FBI want to ensure that you're using your proper training and procedures?
You would think, and every person, whether or not they're an agent or support staff or an analyst, everyone in the FBI goes to the Holocaust Memorial Museum and everyone goes to the MLK Memorial. It's a very specific trip that you take in the academy, and the point of that is to hammer home that those sort of civil rights abuses and genocide and atrocities can only occur with a law enforcement arm that is just going along with a political apparatchik and is weaponized.
And especially with the Holocaust, part of the problem that we heard after World War II that has been documented is that, well, those were my orders. I was told to go along. And you were indicating at the end of the last episode that some of the problems were that the FBI is woke and weaponized, that some people are just afraid to speak up because they're worried about their own career. They are not aware of what is going on, or that they're just taking orders. And that's kind of alarming that they're not using more thought to the orders they're being given.
And I was specifically told that. I said, look, I have an oath of office, and I was told you have a duty to the FBI to do what we tell you to do. And I think a lot of people accept that. And I don't think that there are students of history, because certainly history doesn't smile very kindly on individuals in the past who have used that as an excuse to get away with committing some awful acts. And there's the financial component too. A lot of people are beholden to that paycheck, and they say, I have to put food on the table to support my family. My response to them, and I've come around to saying, look, I would rather have hungry children than morally bankrupt children. And nobody raises their right arm and swears that oath thinking that they're going to be Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos rich. There are other career paths where you don't have to compromise your values. Honestly, if you're willing to go ahead with doing these wrong deeds, misdeeds, in order to keep that paycheck, then I think you've compromised yourself.
You mentioned that you think that the FBI has become woke and that it also is weaponized. Would you elaborate on some of that?
Yeah, so I think we're in the month of June now, the holy month of June, and as we've seen now within corporate America and now the American government. And the FBI is all in for that. Their social media is plastered with pride and the rainbow flag, and now the Pride Progress flag. They're flying that flag next to the American flag outside of the field offices. Next to it, and in some instances, at least in mine in Jacksonville, an entire flag display was put out in our office during June. And I think that, and from what I'm understanding, is not a one-off. And beyond just the events and festivities of June, we have just a general work climate that they're going for, where it's almost like a Silicon Valley startup feel, where you have wellness rooms that are springing up in Newark and Los Angeles that are equipped with massage chairs, and in Newark there's actual signage on the walls that say it's okay to not be productive today. And I don't
say that again.
It's okay to not be productive today, and you're on the government dime. You're on the taxpayers' dole here, and you're supposed to be doing the work of the American people. It's if it's a private organization, if it's a social media empire and they want to let you play ping pong, that's their prerogative. But as far as government service goes, that doesn't have a place within the FBI or any place in the government. And
it should be productive using the proper metrics also, which we went into in the previous episode. Massage chairs. What about, is it affecting the training? I mean, FBI agents, you were dealing with child porn and violent crimes before you were assigned to January 6th. Those are heinous. Murder and child pornography and rapes, those are awful things to have to deal with. It seems to me you've got to be a pretty strong individual to be able to handle that.
Yeah, and I look, you can keep your head down and work those cases without distraction. It's really just the administrative burden that comes on you, where now it's been raised. It used to be 2, now it's 3 diversity, inclusion, equity classes that you have to take every year in the FBI. And it's just detracting from the actual mission that I think people have an expectation for the FBI to perform. And we talked about this offline, but the Human Resources Branch was another example, and this is an incredibly powerful section of the FBI, and those folks organized coloring and art and chair yoga events that were supposed to be happening within the lunchtime to set up a more friendly environment for everybody who's working there, and that's not a one-off. Again, I talked to multiple people that said that there are coloring books that are in break rooms in the FBI offices, and just on a lark they've gone through to see if anybody's done anything, and there are pages that are colored in them that people are actually whipping out the Crayola and trying to stay in the lines. And it's something that we can laugh at, but anybody who's energetic in a position of authority can use this. It didn't take me very long to surmise that the Human Resources Branch oversees the Security Division in the FBI. Security Division is in charge of all the security clearances for every FBI employee who must have one. Should an energetic legislator decide to push to pause everything that the Human Resources Branch is doing, that would mean that all the security clearances are paused in the FBI, and it would not function as an entity until that matter was resolved.
And I think that should be looked into. The FBI does not need to have coloring books. And the fact that human resources, the people who, you said that's a powerful position. Why is that powerful?
You have the opportunity to cultivate the next generation of people. And we're seeing this with the hiring practices that have gone on, where they've reduced standards on some things that all the agent population is up in arms over. They've reduced the physical fitness standards. And look, you don't have to be an Olympic decathlete to be an FBI agent. But I will say this, it's the most revelatory part of the application process, because it's the only thing you know the answers to ahead of time. You know the standards, you can prepare to meet those standards. If you're unwilling to do that, I think it indicates something about your character or your commitment level. And those were reduced because the FBI wanted to open up to more minority candidates, and minority candidates who had failed the physical fitness test, the FBI went back and recontacted once they reduced the standards and specifically had them come in to reapply. And
wouldn't a better program, if you really wanted to take care of, if you felt like for whatever reason the fitness standards were unfairly hindering minority people, wouldn't it be better to create a program to help get the more minority people who couldn't meet those standards up to the standards and say, okay, we want to make sure that you're getting whatever it is that you need. Maybe you need access to a gym or you need a coach or whatever. Let's put you in this almost like a boot camp program to get you where you need to be so that you hit the standards.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's a honest solution you could have. The only counter to that would be we have a standard and we want anybody who applies to our organization to meet that standard, and we're colorblind, we're gender blind, and I don't think anybody cares about the race of the person investigating the fraud or the bank robbery that they were a victim of. And the FBI is not focusing on its core mission, which is to prevent fraud and force against the American population, as opposed to some social experiment.
Well, and it is a social experiment, and the fact that they're changing the standards, they're putting coloring books in, massage chairs, who authorized that it's okay to have a poster that says it's okay not to be productive today? I mean, is that coming from the HR department?
That's a good question. I think that it's probably within discretionary funds, but there's no way that makes it on the wall without an executive's approval, and which means that it cleared multiple hurdles in order to get up there. And I think it just indicates that the FBI wants to create this environment that is conducive to a certain type of personality. And that is the person that is not the alpha-driven go-getter who wants to put bad guys in jail at the highest level. It's the person that's probably going to be willing to go along to get along because they know they have a really sweet gig.
And that's the kind of people the HR department is hiring and cultivating right now. And that's the attitude that's permeating throughout the whole agency.
Yes, they've consistently elevated skills that I think maybe at one point there was an advantage to having, but I don't think is really relevant anymore. I mean, traditionally the FBI was lawyers and accountants. There's now this push within, especially because it's such an intelligence-driven agency, that they get these highly educated folks in to become analysts, and they're basically just writing college term papers for their career, and they're consuming nothing but news sources from one side, and they're not pushed to, as much as the policy says they're supposed to consider counterbalancing news sources and sources of information. Look what Marcus Allen, who sat to my left at that congressional hearing, all he did was get publicly available news reporting about January 6th and bring it to the people that he wanted to make them aware of for their investigations. And he was suspended immediately because they didn't agree with the news source that he brought forward. He didn't draft it, he just found it.
And he is suspended for that.
He's been suspended now for about a year and a half without pay. And that's a veteran of the armed forces who had received an Employee of the Year award from his division and has now been without pay for a year and a half and was on the verge of having to sell his house to feed his family. Unfortunately, we live in a very charitable society, and in the aftermath of the hearing, had a Give, Send, Go account set up, and we're able to raise quite an amount of money that's going to make him whole, going to make Garrett whole, and actually hold some back-end reserve for a future whistleblower, because we don't think their family should go hungry or suffer because they decide to do the right thing.
And we need more people to come forward.
Yes.
Because this is a problem and we need to show that it is system-wide. I think you've already done that. You've got you and New Mexico. Where were the three? Was it just three of you who were on that panel?
So Marcus Allen was from the Columbia Division, and he was in South Carolina. And then you had Garrett O'Boyle, who was in transit from Wichita, Kansas, which is Kansas City, to Virginia. And then I came from the Jacksonville Division. And the most outspoken who was not there was Kyle Seraphin, who came from the Las Cruces, New Mexico resident agency for Albuquerque Division.
So you've got a wide swath of America there, but there were 56 There are 56 field offices.
Yes, that's the way that they sort of break down the country geographically, and it's mostly population driven. So you have heavy population on the East Coast. You have a lot more field offices, and then you have a whole bunch in the middle where there's a lot of territory in there. I mean, I was in a smaller office in Iowa and Nebraska are decently sized, but we had 70 agents for the entire region.
Right. We talked about the management structure and how the managers get a bonus for the number of cases that they open. And if people miss that, they can hear that in the first episode. But there's also a promotion incentive, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's almost like a tempo that you have to move through if you decide that you want to go the managerial track within the FBI. If you want to just work cases, you can work cases. That was what I was sort of content to do. I was making plenty of money and doing what I wanted to do. It just never appealed to me. But other people, they want to do that. You obviously have to have a chain of command. You need a minimum of 6 years in the field to apply. And if you want to ascend that ladder to the highest levels, you have to start that process at 6 years. So you see a lot of these people that after 6 years what do you know after 6 years? I mean, 2 years of probation, and really, especially if you're working on a violation that's not high tempo, you might not have very much actual on-the-ground experience. But nevertheless, they take a temporary transfer to Washington, D.C. It's 18 months. The entire time they are collecting per diem, and they are a program manager over many times an area which they have no knowledge or experience. So I worked on an Indian reservation. I would have a new program manager every 18 months. They'd be calling in, checking in, and they had never worked on an Indian reservation, but they were in charge of overseeing me. Now, if you want to continue to promote, it is a strict calendar. Every 18 months, you have to be looking to that next level up, and that's going to require you to go to the field and then back to Washington, D.C., and then back to the field and back to Washington, D.C. So you're always making that pilgrimage back to the Mecca of the FBI. And to ascend the ladder, you have to be coming up with something new and novel, find a solution, or invent a solution, look for a problem to apply it to. And the first 6 months that a supervisor arrives, they immediately want to, I have an idea, let's do this. And it'll be some sort of, it might be useful, most of the times it's not, but they'll start the wheels rolling on that. They'll spend the middle 6 months canvassing for other opportunities, and then the final 6 months will be their departure to their next job, and they leave behind this unfinished project that we're forced to deal with, either scrapping or implementing. And for the rest of their career, on their resume, they're going to say that they did some sort of initiative. Now, it's a problem because it's politically, it's self-selecting for more of a left-wing person. I mean, a conservative is going to say, where's the waste? Let's get rid of that, back to basics. And a left-wing person is going to say, I got a government program to do with that. I'm not worried about the spending. And as a result of that, those people select into management. They go to D.C. and they sort of imbibe that climate and that atmosphere. And then when they come back out, they infect the field with it. And the joke was that the new boss is like a kidney stone. You hope they're going to pass quickly and with as little pain as possible.
Wow. Can you give, so you guys kind of made fun of new bosses coming in.
Oh, yeah. And they sort of all tell the same story. They all say, this is where I want to be. This is it for me. My entire career is culminated with me being the mid-level supervisor in Des Moines, Iowa. Meanwhile, my family is still in Fredericksburg or Arlington. They haven't made the trip yet. And we know that they're going to 18 months and they'll be gone. And the same pattern is always there. And it's not dawned on them that we're all sitting there staring at them and knowing that they're bald-faced lying to us. In fact, the best supervisors are the ones that are just honest. Now, I never had this, but I know people who have had it where the boss said, I'm here for a year and a half. You're not going to see me at all. I'm going to be in that office looking to the next job. I'll be here if you need anything. And they just kind of were laissez-faire with their management style because they trusted the people to do a good job, which most of the time they do because they're professionals and they're experienced. And many times you have these squads that will be on a particular violation. It could be white collar, bank robbery, gangs, whatever. And you'll have an agent on that squad who's been doing it for a decade, and he knows all the ins and outs, and he knows the local contacts. And that's the person that is really running the show. It's the boss is the figurehead, and kind of leans on that person to give him the talking points that he needs and handle it. And I think if you were going to run it effectively, that's the person that needs to be in a position of management or leadership, begrudgingly, because they're not going to want to give up the work, but that has a vital knowledge base that person has that they should bequeath to the next generation of agents. But that's just not the way that the FBI operates.
And when they come to the field, they leave their family in Virginia or Washington, D.C. So there's kids are still in school. If they have a spouse who's working, the spouse probably keeps a job in D.C.
Many of them do, and it's a lot of times their hands are tied within the field offices. So they'll say there's going to be a supervisor position available. You cannot fill it from within your own ranks. You must accept somebody from Washington, D.C. And they'll say, well, they're up to date on the latest and greatest policies that are in headquarters. But really, it's just sort of this train that they're all on, and they're looking backwards to their buddies to pull them along to guarantee them a nice landing spot, because they have to find a place. If you finish your 18 months, your first stop in Washington, D.C., and you can't find a landing place, you're going back to where you came from, and nobody wants that. They want to climb the next ladder rung, and it gets very competitive. The higher up in that ladder you get, the fewer spots there are, and it gets very political and nasty, which is why the rank and file agent population just looks at headquarters with utter contempt. And that's a problem for the FBI. There's this chasm between the management class and the working class within the same agency.
This part that you're discussing right now, is that part of what you've let Congress know about?
Yes, it is. And I think that there's some solutions to that. I mean, I think the very introductory promotion that those guys get, the program manager, if it is in fact an important position and they're managing a program, should be somebody who actually knows a thing about that program. It doesn't require you to be in Washington to do that if you want to do that. If you want somebody that's going to fill that role and be good at it and effective at it for a number of years, it should be a permanent position. And if you want to entice somebody to do that, why don't you put it somewhere nice? People are always fighting to get to somewhere like Charlotte. Why doesn't Charlotte have a bunch of program managers that are sitting there? But instead, it's an indoctrination. It's an initiation into the headquarters atmosphere that the management class within the FBI has set up for itself.
What other solutions do you think there are to the problems that exist?
Yeah, I have gone back and forth on this, and I think if you made me king for a day, I think that the FBI would probably be gone. But I'm pragmatic enough to know that leaders in Washington are not going to be quick to make that decision.
And government, I think there are a lot of things that need to be gone. And it seems that Congress never wants to get rid of anything, ever. They don't have the will or the courage.
Yeah. But I would proffer this as a solution, and it's actually being beta tested now unintentionally. And I think that this solution would correct a lot of the problems and would actually make the FBI function better. And that is, we eliminate the 1811 criminal investigator position from the FBI. No more guns in the FBI.
Wow.
No more armed special agents. They can be unarmed investigators. Now, the FBI enlists the help of local law enforcement from all over because it's impossible to police the country with just 14,000 agents. That's all the FBI has. You have these local detectives from police departments and sheriff's office, and they come in and they're deputized by the United States Marshals, and they have cross-deputization. They have their state authority from their local agency, and they have federal arrest authority. They also bring a wealth of knowledge because a lot of them have been detectives for a number of years. They know their community. They know the problems. They bring the cases to the FBI that maybe their agency is not equipped to handle. Those numbers need to be beefed up. And the benefit to that is it's going to give you the Main Street usual suspects knowledge as opposed to the metric system, which, again, that needs to be gone. That's coming from headquarters. But it also, it gives the local agency a stopgap measure against an out-of-control FBI. So if the FBI says, Jenny Beth is a domestic terrorist, we got a case on her, we're sending SWAT to her house. Well, you don't have a SWAT team, so you're going to have to go to Jenny Beth's sheriff and his deputies who are cross-deputized as federal agents, and that sheriff's going to be more accountable to you because he's directly elected by you. And he's going to say, no, my people are not going to do this. And I think of it as almost analogous to the way we originally selected senators. The way that our founders set it up was the senators were selected from the state houses, and the purpose of that was to make them more responsive to the needs of the state as opposed to being these federal officials. Same thing can happen here, where the personnel are coming from the locals and the FBI or whatever federal agency is completely dependent on those personnel to enforce what it wants to do.
I have spent about a month on the border in the second quarter of this year and doing interviews with sheriffs and border patrol. And some of this may exist within the FBI, and probably some of the problems you're describing within management of the FBI probably exists within Border Patrol as well. I don't know. But one of the things that I found of these border sheriffs consistently across the board is that they work very closely with Customs and Border Patrol. So they are working very closely with the Border Patrol agents. And across the board, what I was hearing is that the Border Patrol agents live in the community, are part of the community, and they're really partners in enforcing the border and stopping the problems that are coming from the lack of rule of law when it comes to the border. But it seems to me that the FBI wants to be this lone ranger that doesn't partner as much with local law enforcement. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding that?
I think you make a point, and I think that it bears itself out. The field offices, each one of the headquarters cities, so for me it was Jacksonville or Omaha, heavy concentration of agents and support staff, and they report to the office every day, and they're sort of they're looking at that city. But the resident agencies, which I was in Sioux City, Iowa, I was in Daytona Beach, Florida, we live in those communities. We, as a result of that, are ensconced with local law enforcement and with the needs of the community. And if you look at any statistical breakdown of the productivity in the FBI, everybody knows all the good cases come from the resident agencies.
Okay. So that part at least is heartening to know that when the agents are creating roots in the community and understand that the actions that they have affect the place where they live, it seems like they're paying a bit more attention than the people from Washington who are coming in and out, or people who are on the train to get to Washington. Their priorities are much different than that of the local community and the state.
Absolutely. And I mean, you know what the concerns are within your community, what Main Street needs. And that was always the knock on what J. Edgar Hoover brought in, which was this need to relocate people when they came, because he was concerned about having a conflict of interest. You can't be in your community because you might have to investigate somebody who you know, and that's going to create a conflict. That's not really the case anymore. I don't even know if there ever really was. I know for a fact when I was relocated from Savannah, Georgia to Sioux City, Iowa, they lost a person who had law enforcement contacts with a dozen agencies and knowledge about what was going on in Savannah, and had to relearn all those same things when I was relocated. And meanwhile, when they filled a spot in Savannah, that person had to relearn all those things. So there was this, we're always behind the curve trying to catch up.
And that can wind up, if there is truly a domestic terrorism case or something that really is a serious crime, losing that kind of knowledge and those kind of relationships could put everyone behind the eight ball if something serious was brewing.
Yes. I mean, when you come in, just the process of having to introduce yourself around is cumbersome. It takes a long time. When I arrived in my first assignment, I would say it took me a year to a year and a half to build the trust, even at a base level, with a lot of the local law enforcement, because the FBI has this reputation of being those two jerk agents from Die Hard. They're Agent Johnson and Agent Johnson, no relation, because we're the best. And they hurt themselves stretching to pat themselves on the back by calling themselves the premier law enforcement agency. Nobody likes the FBI. Right. And for me to be there for the length of time that I was, and then finally they were like, "Oh, you're the police. You're not bureau. You're police." And that's when we started to really roll with our productivity and actually bring a lot of cases in, because those guys would be calling me and texting me. And look, it's not fun to get woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning, but that's the job that I signed up to do. And it actually was, maybe the next day thinking about, well, that was really great. That crisis happened. What are we going to do? We're going to call Steve. We're going to call the FBI. And they knew that resource was there. And that, again, was my prime directive. I wanted to make their job better. I get the answer, do whatever I could to get the answer to yes for them. And that should be always what is driving the FBI.
You mentioned J. Edgar Hoover just a minute ago. I have been in the FBI, I suppose it's the FBI building, because it was the J. Edgar Hoover building one time, and it was not a good experience. But one of the things that I realized walking into the building is it's the J. Edgar Hoover building. And I just sat there thinking, of course the FBI isn't going to do what it needs to be doing. The building's named after someone who didn't even follow the law and protocol and had surveillance going on of people who never should have been surveilled. And what was the reward or the punishment? Well, I don't know that there was a punishment, but the reward was he has a building named after him. And it just seems to me that if that is the kind of reward that you get for breaking the law, it's sending a message to all the agents who work there. It's okay if you cut corners or do things you shouldn't. We're not going to hold you accountable. I was there because I was trying to get accountability of the IRS when they targeted our organization and the statute of limitations had not run out, and I was making a case that it should be investigated further. And I walked away knowing that nothing was going to happen from it, and I decided in that moment, and this was years ago now, that the entire agency, the Department of Justice, has major problems. So anyway, my point is, it just seems to me that there has been a history throughout the entire existence of the FBI that there's a problem. Do you think that the agents know that? And what do you think of the history?
I don't think most of the agents know it. I think you're probably more well-versed on the history of the FBI than most agents or personnel in the FBI actually are. I think most people within the FBI kind of know the pop culture FBI that they see on TV and movies. But being a student of history myself, I think that there's a good case to be made that the FBI's origins make it an extra-constitutional organization. It was brought about as a Bureau of Investigations, not originally under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, but he took that home pretty quickly. And it was one of these situations where it was better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And it launched, and then Congress sort of backdated legislation. But because of that origin story being in its DNA, the FBI is less about preserving the Constitution or protecting the Constitution and the continuity of our government, and more about preserving the status quo from whoever is in power. Now, the Venn diagram from one may overlap with the other. And I think in the early days of the FBI, that got a lot of people convinced that the FBI was an objective force for good. And you take the pursuit of communism in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and people assumed that, well, the FBI is anti-communist, they must be pro-Constitution. Well, no, just the people in power were anti-communist. But when the people in power were against draft dodgers for the Vietnam War, the FBI opened cases and investigated draft dodgers. And when the people in power didn't like Martin Luther King, the FBI had COINTELPRO, where they tried to encourage him to commit suicide.
That's horrible.
And now, have we seen in the last 2 decades, since the war on terror has come home, and this focus, this mission, this national security mission that the FBI has been tasked with since September 11th, the FBI has evolved from a criminal investigation organization, a law enforcement agency, into a intelligence agency. Now, 9/11 happens and the threat is abroad. Our military engages that threat and stamps it down. The FBI receives a whole bunch of funding and a mission set that's sort of to control that at home, because the military can't do that. Well, the military did such a great job, there really wasn't a threat here. The FBI has to justify its existence. The federal government is a self-licking ice cream cone. So they had to target somebody else. So they looked at homegrown violent extremism. And that's where you got to tip your cap to our friends over on the left, who've been saying for years that the FBI targeted Muslim Americans unjustifiably, and they entrapped them. And we all were kind of still in the gung-ho post 9/11. No, they're all terrorists. And I think a lot of us looked away and just assumed that the FBI, again, was an objective force for good. Well, the homegrown violent extremist well ran dry. The FBI has to exist. It has to justify that. Now it's evolved into domestic violent extremism. And that is being characterized most recently, again, to preserve the status quo, by our very left-leaning government, anti-government extremism, and anti-ethnic extremism, parenthetically, white supremacy. So go backwards to September 1st of last year, the red speech that President Biden delivered, where he characterized MAGA Republicans and then eventually just Republicans. They're anti-government and they're white supremacist. Well, the anti-government piece of that, I'd argue there were 56 men who signed a Declaration of Independence that were pretty anti-government. But nevertheless, those two, anti-government and white supremacy, are two of the top priorities within counterterrorism division within the FBI. And the president, the commander-in-chief, has now said that those are half of the people in the country.
Basically, anyone who didn't vote for him or they think didn't vote for him is a target of the FBI right now. Maybe that's overstating it.
Well, with the intelligence agency component thrown in with that sort of directive to targeting, and the combine that with the stats padding that they want to do, all is in this vile stew. And as a result of that, you open an intelligence investigation up not to pursue a criminal, to get intelligence, to then get more intelligence, to then spin off more intelligence investigations against other people. And the dragnet gets bigger and bigger. We can write more intelligence reports now, hit those quotas, and that's how you get radical traditional Catholic reports coming out of the Richmond field office. And back to the status quo argument to that, read that report. Now, obviously, the author of it had some animosity towards the Catholic Church. Only consulted Salon.com and the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Atlantic. And I would contend that looked at the political grievances that our ruling elite has, and that was pro-life, pro-traditional marriage, pro-border sovereignty, and said, those are make you radicalized. Those are the ideologies that can make you prone to become an anti-government extremism. That's a fairly significant portion of this country.
And then we see, I'm a little bit speechless when it comes to this, because I try hard not to be completely hyperbolic when I'm talking about things, but it's hard not to think that they essentially are going after anyone who doesn't vote their way. That,
or anybody who is a perceived political enemy, and they're willing to weaponize the processes to do that, and be it sending a SWAT team to somebody's house when that's not necessary. I was part of the Gretchen Whitmer takedown. We were told that those guys were just as equipped, well-trained, prepared, had encrypted communications, and were intending on getting into a gunfight with us as a SWAT team.
And what was the reality?
They were completely entrapped, and it was exposed at trial that they were not capable of carrying out anything like that. But that was the only instance in my entire time on SWAT that I did not call my wife after I got my briefing and tell her what my responsibility was going to be the next day, what I was going to be performing, because I was that convinced that I was going to get into a gunfight and I didn't want to worry her. Now, that's one aspect of weaponization. Take a completely different one, the lawfare aspect, where the DOJ and the FBI are reinterpreting laws, or they're weaponizing process crimes to go after their perceived enemies. So they reinterpret a law, and the best example is the obstruction or impeding of an official proceeding. That is a law that came from Sarbanes-Oxley right after the Enron collapse. And it was intended to shore up these rogue accountants that were shredding documents, essentially tampering with evidence to prevent this prosecution of the executives at Enron. So Congress drafts that law. Okay. Well, it's a felony, and it's been reinterpreted now for people who walked through the Capitol on January 6th. Now, you can dispute the criminality of either one of those things, but certainly shredding documents and then walking through a public building are two completely different activities. But the DOJ is interpreted that way so they can tack felonies onto so many of these January 6th subjects. That law is also being reinterpreted to apply to Donald Trump with his dealings with the documents that were at Mar-a-Lago. Again, completely different activity. It shouldn't fall under the same law, but the FBI and the DOJ are interpreting it that way to use it against their enemies. And then there's the process crimes, and I was almost a victim of it myself, where I was set up to lie in the hopes that I would lie and lack candor. The best example that I can come up with is Michael Flynn. James Comey has admitted publicly and laughed about the fact that he sent over 2 special agents in the early days of the Trump administration to go and interview Mike Flynn, the incoming national security advisor. Now, the predicate for their investigation was this very flimsy, not outright fake Russian collusion case, but there's actual documents that came from high up in the FBI that said, what is the point of us doing this? Is it to get him to lie so that we can get him fired or prosecute him for a crime? Which is exactly what they did. They contrived him.
Which shouldn't be legal at all. They shouldn't legally be allowed to just walk in and try to get someone to lie so they can fire them. They shouldn't be there talking to them at all.
No, a process crime, a 18 U.S.C. 1001 is the lowest level federal felony you could have. If I walked into a federal prosecutor's office and said, I think I have a 1001 charge on Jenny Beth, they would laugh me out of the room, because that is the case fell apart, we can't quite make it, or it's a plea deal negotiation, something that's used. It's never the actual reason for the investigation. It's always a righteous investigation, and along the way, Jenny Beth lied, so we're going to tack this on. But never the initiating crime or criminal offense, and that is now out the door. The FBI is initiating these in the hopes that they can start a lying to a federal agent investigation.
This is a major problem, and it's really shocking that they used a law that they intended to prevent people from basically shredding evidence in a white-collar crime. That they use that same law and to go after accountants for the people who walked through the Capitol on January 6th, and for Trump keeping documents, which it doesn't sound to me like he ever intended to shred them at all. He was preserving them. It's very twisted. There have been whistleblowers that have come out in addition to the ones you testified with. We have seen reports and the transcripts of the IRS whistleblowers, and you have highlighted to me that what got lost in the news as the IRS whistleblowers came out, that there also was another FBI whistleblower. What have you looked into those, and what do you think of those whistleblowers' comments?
The FBI whistleblower was pretty significant to me and to my experience, because that person, who has remained anonymous, was a 16-year veteran of the FBI, had been within the management chain for 10 years. So nobody I cross paths with is in the belly of the beast at headquarters. And the information that this guy brought out was that in the aftermath of January 6th, in February, there was these almost daily calls that were going on to give updates to senior executives around the country. So lots of people on the phone call. And the comment was made by Paul Abate, who was newly elevated to deputy director and recently kind of testified in front of the Senate Judiciary and refused to answer their questions. So it was pretty intransigent. But he made comments during this call that said that anybody who was comparing the FBI's lack of action against anything that happened in 2020 to its now seemingly very aggressive action in January 6th needed to consider job elsewhere, outside the agency. and that if anybody voiced concerns or disagreement with the way that the FBI was handling January 6th, that their managers should direct them to call Paul Abate directly, and he would set them straight. And I think that sort of chilling and open threat coming from that high up is significant for two reasons. One, it corroborates everything that I've been saying, that I was canceled because I brought a concern forward. Whistleblowing doesn't require you to be right. It just requires you to be reasonable. There's no question that my concerns are reasonable, and I was canceled as a result of that. And this corroborates it. Secondly, it corroborates what the Durham report had and what John Durham spoke to when he was in front of the House Judiciary Committee, and that is the confirmation bias that is within the FBI, and it's reached all the way to the number 2 spot that we can definitely confirm. We don't know what Christopher Wray's actions are. He always just says, can't comment on an ongoing investigation. But Paul Abate is the number 2, and he certainly has this confirmation bias where he thinks that this is unwilling to even hear another opinion, and that is not what law enforcement is supposed to be about.
When in the first episode that I had with you, you mentioned that when you first were taken off of child pornography and put onto January 6th, that you hadn't even paid attention to January 6th. Were you a political animal before all of this began?
Yeah, I've always been a consumer of the news and followed it closely, probably as an adult, I would say. But that day, I was on an Indian reservation without cell or internet. I didn't know what happened until I came home that night. My dad called me up and said, "Did you see what happened today?" No idea. So the actual events of the day were a complete shock to me. And I had questions about the 2020 election, I think just like a lot of people did, and I was hoping that we would get some of those answers. But as a rooting interest, and I told this to my supervisors, I didn't have a dog in the fight. I didn't vote for either major party in 2020. So it was not a question of sour grapes. It has always been, as it always was, a question of professionalism to me and upholding the oath that I took serious. And I wanted to be buttoned up in any prosecution that I brought forward. And at that point even was taking it in good faith that my colleagues around the country had done their best to bring a case forward. And I didn't want it to fall apart because I'd actually been to trial and had those pitfalls that you have to sort of tiptoe around to avoid losing a good case. So I was concerned about that. And then the more I learned about January 6th and the people that we were bringing into this dragnet, that's when I became concerned about the process, is the punishment. And there's an Eighth Amendment concern here, where we have people in jail that have never had their day in court for years on end. And it doesn't matter what your offense is. You're entitled to your day in court. And then I also have due process concerns. Look at the juries that are there, and they're convicting these people of crimes within minutes. And you have the voir dire process where they're selecting juries. And I've talked to journalists that have sat through that process, and I've sat through that process too. And the joke is, you never want to go to a jury because it's 12 people who are too dumb to get out of jury duty. And to watch the people say whatever they can to get off that jury duty. Nobody wants to sit there for days on end. But from what I understand that's going on in D.C., it's the exact opposite. People are saying whatever they can to get on the juries. And even if they do say things that you would think any objective, unbiased jurist or judge would toss them off, it doesn't matter. So they're being asked, did you watch the January 6th committee hearings? Yes. Well, how much? Several hours a day. Do you have any connection to anybody in the Capitol who works there? Yes, family members who work there, permanent staff, and they're all being allowed on the jury. So that's a due process concern for me. And again, back to my training of this can only happen if nobody throws the flag. And I might not be in Washington, D.C., but I have eyes to see and ears to hear. And if that's going on, we as an agency, it's incumbent on us. We took this oath to sound the alarm.
You were told when you were raising concerns that multiple police officers died that day. Did you think that was true? And what is the truth about that?
No, at that point I was aware that that didn't happen and that the Brian Sicknick narrative that we were all fed was completely false and erroneous. And I pointed that out to my supervisor, and he said that I really need to go back and examine the facts. And then stunningly, when I did my deposition, my transcribed interview, the Democrat attorneys brought up the same point, and they said that police officers were killed. And I said, no, they weren't. The sick Nick had died of the stroke the next day, and there were some other health issues and a suicide. And the new narrative from what I learned at that point was that because the DOJ has ruled 3 of those officers in the line of duty deaths, that is the narrative that they're going with. They're saying, well, they were killed by January 6th protesters.
So suicide is an in the line of duty death?
The DOJ ruled 3 officers as in the line of duty deaths. And look, you could say, well, maybe they were trying to just help the families with compensation, because if it's an in the line of duty death, they probably get some benefits, and maybe they're trying to do that, and you can question the morality or the legality of that. But maybe they did that. But I would argue that and submit that they did that so they can continue to have the talking point that police officers were killed by January 6th protesters. And I pointed out to the Democrat attorneys in my deposition, well, this one died on the 7th, and this one died on the 9th, and this one died on the 12th. So I stand by my statement that no police officers were killed on January 6th by the protesters. And I think they're happy to have their one-page DOJ memo.
And the truth doesn't matter.
No, it hasn't for a long time.
But they'll get you if you lie to them. They'll put you in jail if you lie to them, but the truth doesn't matter to them.
No, and that's been the fight that I've had for all this time. And I keep saying, I don't have to be right. I just have to be reasonable. You can call me whatever you want. Certainly, Dan Goldman accused me of being a grifter. Stacey Plaskett implied that I was potentially committing espionage. You had Debbie Wasserman Schultz that threw everything she possibly could up against the wall and saying that I was a profiteer or a political activist. And in my statement, I said all of that. And even tossed in conspiracy theorists for good measure. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It is incumbent on the people that I brought this to who are in that position, and they're supposed to take my information and consider it. They have to decide if it's reasonable and correct or reasonable and incorrect. But either way, I was doing my job. And I said this earlier, you can accuse me of all those things, you haven't accused me of being wrong. And I get all the flack, and that means I'm over the target.
Absolutely. I think that we're extraordinarily lucky and blessed that you have come forward and that the others have come forward. We are learning more about what's going on inside these agencies. Hopefully, at some point soon, we can get accountability from Congress. If we don't, it concerns me because what the FBI fears could wind up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're not cleaning up their own house.
It's been my fear since the beginning that because the FBI has been so politicized and now is openly targeting one side, that they've cut off the Overton window for political discussion from people. You and I can sit across this table and talk about any issue we want. Let's just say like tax rates. We could have a disagreement. We can reach a compromise. We might not. It doesn't matter. We can have a conversation. If you think I'm a domestic terrorist, you're never going to have that conversation with me.
Right.
And as a result of the FBI's conduct and the way it's treated half of the country, that is going to raise the temperature on this boiling pot. And the pot's going to boil over, and the premier law enforcement agency is going to have a hand in a lot of violence and destruction as a result of it.
Well, I hope that what the House Republicans are doing to investigate all of this, we can bring forward the truth. I hope that people buy your book and read more about what happened so that they understand what you went through. I hope the other whistleblowers write their stories out as well. We need this public record of it, and we need to be able to use what has happened to try to correct the problems. I would contend the FBI needs to go away and that we don't even have a Department of Justice. It's much more a Department of Injustice than justice. But if we're going to be stuck with the agency, then it needs to be handled properly.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I think that it's going to be a tough hill to climb with Congress or anybody in government to remove or end an agency. But I kind of laid out a potential reform here. And I think with the willingness that I'm seeing recently with the Holman rule being available and at the fingertips of the House to zero out some salaries and end some specific programs. And they've reached out to me for suggestions. So there's definitely some appetite amongst some of the members to do it. And maybe just get that percolating within the conversations up on the Hill. Maybe there could be some nibbling around the edges here before if there's a change at the top that we could maybe have some massive reform, which is definitely necessary.
That makes a lot of sense. And you're working remind people who you're working for right now, where you're able to make these recommendations. Yeah,
I work for Center for Renewing America. It's a 501c3 that focuses on identifying and making policy recommendations against woke and weaponized government. And I'm a senior fellow on domestic intelligence and security services there. And if you want to learn about them, they do great work, not just on the FBI, all across the board. It's americarenewing.com.
And Russ Vogt heads that up.
Yes, he does. He's the president.
And he's really good. So everyone should check out that website and check out what they are doing. And then as you make policy recommendations at Tea Party Patriots Action, we can ask people to take action on those. Hopefully we can address some of this in the coming funding debates that we will be having over appropriations and ultimately whatever the omnibus or cromnibus becomes.
Agreed. I mean, I think that's really, they got to use the power of the purse strings. It's the days of these strongly worded letters have reached their end. We need to actually put some teeth behind it. Otherwise, it's like having it's like having a gunfight where one side brings their 6-shooter and the other side brings a letter from mommy that says you can't use a 6-shooter. You're going to lose that gunfight. You have to use the powers that you have and win the argument in the arena of ideas.
Okay, and I just want to say something because I think people are going to listen to this and they're going to be very, very, very discouraged. And what I recommend to everyone is we'll do everything we can in the policy fights right now, given the makeup of Congress. And then in 2024, our focus has to be on securing and winning elections. So don't give up hope. We just have to buckle down or dig down deep in 2024 and make sure we're doing those things so that we can have the change at the top and try to get even more change in 2025. Yeah,
agreed. I mean, the solution is and always will be grassroots, starts at the lowest level, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate as far as where you look to for your actual impact on your life, and then the impact that you can make. Paint the fence. It's always applicable. Paint the fence in your yard and do what you can, and we'll get this whole thing painted.
And no one should lose hope. It's frustrating. It's easy to get really discouraged and be very cynical, but you've gone through all of this and you've sacrificed personally, and you're not losing hope. You're standing up for what is right and urging others to do the same.
I wouldn't have done what I did if I wasn't long on America. It just would have been too easy to just go along, to get along and then have a long career, and that's not what I signed up to do. I signed up to serve the country because I want the country to continue and prosper, and I have children that I want to set an example for and have them enjoy this country. My biggest thing that I've been come around to saying is that America, we always say that America is an idea. I think America is an action verb. You have to do America, and that requires you to get out of your comfort zone. It's not a leisure pursuit all the time, but if you do that, you're going to have a good time in it, and that's why our nation has prospered so greatly. So I'd encourage everybody to look what you can do in your life, and if we all do that, I think we can pull this thing out.
All right, audience, you've heard Steve Friend. We have to do America, make sure that we are doing everything we can to preserve and protect liberty, and don't lose hope in America. Thank you so much, Steve, for being with us today.
I appreciate it.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin, produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, and directed by Luke Livingston. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.
If you like this episode, let me know by hitting the like button or leaving a comment or a 5-star review. And if you want to be the first to know every time we drop a new episode, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications on whichever platform you're listening to. If you do these simple things, it will help the podcast grow, and I appreciate it very much.